Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want to take you that fascinated me for years. A journey hidden between a few mysterious verses in Genesis and an ancient book that has sparked curiosity, debate, and wonder for thousands of years. Because the more I studied the story of Enoch, the more I realized something strange. Out of all the people who ever lived before the Great Flood, why was Enoch the one man God chose to take without allowing him to experience death? And what happened after that extraordinary moment? Did Enoch simply disappear into heaven, as many people assume, or was he invited to witness something far greater, something hidden beyond the clouds, beyond the stars, beyond everything we normally imagine when we think about eternity? Tonight we will walk together through a forgotten path, a path that leads through celestial realms, ancient mysteries, angelic beings, paradise, judgment, and ultimately to the throne of the Ancient of Days himself. And as we travel through this story, I invite you to bring your questions with you, the questions humanity has been asking for thousands of years. What happens after death? Where do souls go? Are angels truly watching over creation? And what lies beyond the world we can see? Because Enoch's journey may not answer every mystery, but it offers a glimpse into a reality far bigger, far deeper, and far more astonishing than most people have ever imagined. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, take a slow breath, let the noise of today begin to fade away, and together, let us follow the footsteps of a man who walked with God and was invited to see what very few human beings have ever seen: the seven heavens of Enoch. For as long as I can remember, there has been one name in the Bible that has quietly fascinated me more than almost any other. Not Moses, not David, not even Elijah, but Enoch. A man who appears only briefly in the book of Genesis, a man whose entire story can be read in less than a minute, and yet somehow the mystery surrounding him has echoed through thousands of years of history. Every time I return to those ancient verses, I find myself asking the same question: why? Why would God preserve the name of this man so carefully while telling us so little about him? Think about it for a moment. Genesis is filled with generations of people, fathers and sons, lives measured by years, and almost every name follows the exact same pattern. They lived, they had children, and then they died. The rhythm repeats again and again. This is almost like the steady beat of a drum, reminding us of the reality that every human being eventually faces. But then, suddenly, the pattern breaks. We arrive at Enoch, and everything changes. The text does not say that he died. It does not tell us where he was buried. It does not describe a funeral. Instead, Genesis says something astonishingly simple. Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more, because God took him. Every time I read those words, I slow down because they feel unlike anything else in the chapter. God took him, not death, not old age, not sickness. God himself. It is almost as though the writer wants us to stop, to linger, to recognize that we have just encountered something extraordinary. Because among the countless people who have lived throughout human history, very few can claim such a description. In fact, according to scripture, only two men are recorded as leaving this world without experiencing death: Enoch and later Elijah. That alone should capture our attention. Imagine standing in a world where death had become the universal destination for every human life. Generation after generation disappearing into the grave, and then suddenly hearing about a man who simply walked so closely with God, that one day he was gone. Not because life ended, but because God invited him somewhere beyond it. Whenever I think about that, I cannot help wondering what the people around Enoch must have thought. Did they search for him? Did they wait for him to return? Did his family struggle to understand what had happened? Or did they recognize that something sacred had taken place, something that could not be explained by ordinary human experience? And perhaps the greatest question of all: where did he go? You see, the Bible tells us what happened, but only briefly. It opens a door and then leaves us standing on the threshold, staring into a mystery. We are told that Enoch walked with God. We are told that God took him. But what happened next? What did Enoch see? What did he experience? Was he brought directly into the presence of God? Did he witness realities hidden from the rest of humanity? Did he see things so extraordinary that human language could barely describe them? The deeper I explored these questions, the more I realized that Enoch's story is not merely about one man. It is about the possibility of a relationship with God so profound, so genuine, so transformative that it changes everything. In a world obsessed with power, achievement, recognition, and success, the Bible highlights Enoch for a completely different reason. It does not celebrate him as a king, a warrior, or a ruler of nations. Instead, it remembers him for one thing: he walked with God. There is something deeply moving about that, because it suggests that what mattered most about Enoch was not what he accomplished, but who he walked beside. And perhaps that is why his story continues to resonate today, because many of us secretly long for that same closeness. We want to know that God is not distant, not unreachable, not hidden beyond the stars. We want to believe that a real relationship with him is possible. The story of Enoch whispers that it is. Yet even as that thought brings comfort, another mystery remains waiting in the shadows. Because if Enoch truly walked with God, and if God took him from the earth, then what happened after that moment? Where did the journey lead? Beyond the clouds, beyond the visible heavens, beyond the boundaries of ordinary human understanding. What awaited him there? Those questions have fascinated believers for centuries. And as we continue this journey together, we are about to discover why Enoch was different, why his story refuses to disappear into history, and why a few short verses in Genesis may contain one of the greatest mysteries ever recorded in Scripture. The more I thought about Enoch, the more one question kept returning to my mind. What made him different? Not simply different from the people around him, but different enough that God would take him from the earth without allowing him to experience death. Because when we look carefully at the biblical record, we discover something remarkable. Scripture does not spend much time describing Enoch's appearance, his achievements, his possessions, or even the details of his daily life. Instead, it focuses almost entirely on one defining characteristic: Enoch walked with God. At first glance, those words may seem simple, perhaps even ordinary, but the longer I sit with them, the more extraordinary they become. Because Genesis tells us that Enoch walked with God for 300 years. 300 years. Let that sink in for a moment. Not 3 days, not 3 months, not even 30 years. 3 centuries of faithful companionship with the Creator. Imagine how many seasons passed during that time, how many sunrises he witnessed, how many storms he endured, how many disappointments, temptations, questions, and uncertainties crossed his path. Yet through all of it, Scripture gives the same testimony. Enoch walked with God. I often find myself wondering what that actually looked like. Because walking with someone implies more than merely believing they exist. You can believe someone exists and never speak to them. You can acknowledge their presence and still keep your distance. But walking with someone is different. Walking requires relationship. It requires trust. It requires direction. When two people walk together, they move toward the same destination. They share the same path. They spend time in one another's company. And perhaps that is exactly what the Bible wants us to understand about Enoch. He did not merely know about God. He knew God day after day, year after year, decade after decade. He chose God's company over the distractions of the world around him. And that raises another fascinating question. What kind of world was Enoch living in? Sometimes we imagine the ancient world as a simpler time, but the Bible paints a very different picture. Humanity was already moving further and further away from God. Pride was growing. Violence was increasing. Corruption was spreading. The seeds of the rebellion that would eventually lead to the flood were already taking root. Yet in the middle of that generation, one man chose a different path. While others were becoming consumed by the concerns of the world, Enoch kept walking with God. Um, that is what makes his story so powerful, because his faithfulness was not expressed in isolation, it was demonstrated in contrast. The darker the world became, the brighter his devotion appeared. And perhaps that is one reason his life still speaks to us today, because many of us live in a world that feels increasingly chaotic, a world filled with noise, distraction, anxiety, and endless demands for our attention. Every day, countless voices compete for our focus. Yet the story of Enoch reminds us that a different way of living is possible, a life centered not on the approval of people, but on fellowship with God. The phrase walked with God appears only a handful of times in Scripture, and every time it carries tremendous significance. It suggests agreement with God's will, alignment with God's heart, a daily choice to move in the same direction as the one who created us. It is not about perfection, because no human being is perfect. Rather, it is about consistency, about returning to God again and again, about choosing faithfulness over convenience, even when no one else seems to notice. What strikes me most deeply is that Genesis could have described Enoch in countless other ways. It could have called him wise, influential, uh, successful, respected, yet none of those descriptions appear. Instead, God preserved a testimony far more profound. Enoch walked with God. It is almost as though heaven itself was saying, "This is what truly matters." Long after achievements fade, long after monuments crumble, long after entire civilizations disappear into history, relationship with God remains. And this is where Enoch begins to stand apart from the rest of humanity. Because while many people throughout history have believed in God, few have walked with him so closely that their entire lives became a testimony of that relationship. The difference was not that Enoch possessed extraordinary power. The difference was not intelligence, status, or influence. The difference was intimacy. He cultivated a friendship with God that shaped every part of his existence. And perhaps that is why his story refuses to disappear, because deep down, every human heart longs for that kind of connection, a relationship that brings meaning, purpose, and peace even in a broken world. Yet, the more we understand Enoch's walk with God, the more mysterious his story becomes. Because if his life was truly marked by such extraordinary faithfulness, then perhaps God's decision to take him was not a random event. Perhaps it was the culmination of something much deeper, a relationship unlike any other, a friendship that ultimately led beyond the boundaries of ordinary human experience. And that brings us to another question that has fascinated believers for generations. If Enoch walked with God so closely on earth, what happened when that walk continued beyond the earth itself? As I continued exploring the mystery of Enoch, I eventually arrived at a question that has sparked debate for centuries. If Enoch's story is so important, why do most people know so little about it? Why does the Bible tell us that God took Enoch, yet offer only a handful of verses about what happened next? The deeper I searched for answers, the more often I encountered the same ancient text, a text surrounded by fascination, controversy, curiosity, and countless unanswered questions. The Book of Enoch. Now, perhaps you have heard that name before, or perhaps this is your first encounter with it. Either way, I remember the first time I seriously began reading about this remarkable book, and I immediately understood why it has captivated believers and scholars alike for generations. Because unlike the brief references we find in Genesis, the Book of Enoch presents itself as a much larger account, one that describes visions, heavenly journeys, angels, judgment, cosmic mysteries, and encounters with realities that seem to exist beyond the visible world. Suddenly, the quiet figure who appears for only a moment in Genesis becomes the central witness of an extraordinary spiritual journey. But this is where things become interesting and perhaps a little complicated, because the Book of Enoch occupies a unique place in history. It is not included in most modern Bibles, yet it has never completely disappeared from the conversation. In fact, for centuries, many people assumed the book had been lost forever, hidden somewhere in the distant past, known only through fragments and references preserved by ancient writers. Then something remarkable happened. In the middle of the 20th century, archaeologists made one of the most important discoveries in biblical history, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Hidden for nearly 2,000 years inside caves near the Dead Sea, these ancient manuscripts provided an extraordinary glimpse into the beliefs and writings circulating during the centuries before Jesus walked the earth. Among those discoveries were portions of the Book of Enoch. Suddenly, a text that many had dismissed as legendary or forgotten was found among some of the most significant ancient manuscripts ever uncovered. I often pause when I think about that discovery because it tells us something important, whether one fully accepts the book's claims or not. The people who preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls clearly considered Enoch worthy of careful attention. This was not some modern invention. It was a text known and respected in the ancient world. But the evidence does not stop there. One of the details that fascinated me most was discovering that Enoch appears not only in ancient manuscripts, but also within the pages of the New Testament itself, specifically in the Epistle of Jude, a short but powerful letter found near the end of the Bible. Jude includes a passage that closely parallels a prophecy attributed to Enoch. Think about that for a moment. A New Testament writer references material associated with Enoch. That fact alone has generated enormous discussion among theologians and historians. Some see it as evidence of the book's significance, others approach it more cautiously, yet, regardless of where one stands, the connection is impossible to ignore. The name of Enoch echoes from Genesis through ancient Jewish tradition, through the Dead Sea Scrolls, and even into the New Testament era. And that naturally raises another question. If the Book of Enoch was known in the ancient world, why is it controversial today? Why do some believers embrace it while others remain skeptical? The answer is not as simple as many people assume. Part of the controversy comes from the extraordinary nature of its content. The book describes angels descending to earth, heavenly realms, cosmic structures, cosmixtures, and judgment scenes, and visions that stretch far beyond what is explicitly described in Genesis. For some readers, these accounts feel profound and illuminating. For others, they raise questions about interpretation, symbolism, and historical reliability. Another reason for the debate is that different faith traditions have approached the book differently throughout history. Some ancient communities treated it with great respect. Certain Christian traditions preserved it more carefully than others. Meanwhile, many later church leaders chose not to include it within the biblical canon recognized by most Christians today. As a result, the Book of Enoch occupies a fascinating position. It is neither entirely forgotten nor universally accepted. It stands at the crossroads of history, inviting investigation while provoking discussion. And perhaps that is precisely why it continues to attract attention after so many centuries. Because deep down, people sense that it touches questions they have always wanted answered. Questions about angels, heaven, judgment, the unseen realm, and humanity's relationship with God. Yet as intriguing as the debates surrounding the book may be, like I have come to believe that the most important question is not whether the Book of Enoch is controversial. The more important question is why the figure of Enoch himself remains so unforgettable. Why has his story endured while countless other ancient texts have faded into obscurity? Why do references to this mysterious man continue appearing across generations, drawing people back to the same questions again and again? Perhaps the answer lies not merely in the book that bears his name, but in the extraordinary journey it claims to describe. A journey that begins the moment Enoch is taken from the earth and steps into realities few human beings have ever imagined. And as we continue our exploration, we are about to reach the point where that journey truly begins. The deeper I followed the story of Enoch, the more I began to realize that everything we have explored so far has only been preparation. The mystery of his life, his extraordinary relationship with God, the ancient book that bears his name, all of it seems to point toward a single moment, a moment unlike anything else in human history. Because eventually we arrive at the question that has fascinated believers for thousands of years. What happened on the day God took Enoch? I want you to imagine it with me for a moment, not as a distant legend, not as a story disconnected from reality, but as a real event experienced by a real man. A man who woke up one morning much like any other. A man who had spent centuries walking faithfully with God. A man who had no idea that his journey through the visible world was about to give way to something far greater. The ancient traditions surrounding Enoch describe a moment when heaven itself seemed to draw near, a moment when messengers from God appeared before him. Now, whenever we read about angels in Scripture, it is easy to forget how overwhelming such encounters truly were. Nearly every person who encountered an angel responded the same way, with awe, fear, wonder, and trembling. These were not soft figures floating quietly through the sky. They were powerful messengers of the living God, beings whose very presence reminded humanity that there is far more to reality than what we can see. And according to the ancient accounts, Enoch found himself standing before such messengers, not because he sought them, not because he demanded signs, but because God had chosen him for something extraordinary. As I reflect on that scene, I cannot help but wonder what was going through Enoch's mind. Was he afraid? Was he overwhelmed? Did he immediately understand what was happening? Or did he simply trust the God he had walked with for so many years, believing that wherever this path led, God would remain with him? Perhaps that is one of the most remarkable things about Enoch. His story is not primarily about visions, angels, or heavenly mysteries. It is about trust. Long before he ever saw the heavens, he learned to trust the one who made them. And now, that trust was about to carry him beyond the boundaries of human experience. According to the traditions surrounding his journey, the messengers instructed Enoch to prepare himself, not for death, but for ascent. Think about how extraordinary that is. Every other human being expects life to end with a grave. Enoch was being invited somewhere else entirely, somewhere no living person had gone before, somewhere beyond mountains, beyond clouds, beyond the stars themselves, somewhere hidden behind the veil separating the visible and invisible worlds. And this is where I invite you to come with me, because from this point forward, we are no longer standing safely on familiar ground. We are stepping into a journey that explores the great mysteries people have wondered about for centuries. Questions about heaven, angels, judgment, eternity, and the presence of God. I do not want you to think of this as merely reading an ancient text. Instead, imagine yourself walking beside Enoch. Imagine watching the earth slowly fall away beneath your feet. Imagine looking upward and realizing that everything you have ever known about the sky is only the beginning, because that is exactly what makes Enoch's journey so compelling. It challenges our assumptions. Most people hear the word heaven and immediately imagine paradise, golden streets, peace, rest, the throne of God. Yet, one of the most surprising discoveries in Enoch's account is that the journey does not begin there. In fact, the first thing Enoch encounters is not what most people would call heaven at all. And I remember being genuinely surprised when I first realized this, because I expected the story to begin with paradise. I expected Enoch to step immediately into the presence of God, but that is not what happens. Instead, he is shown something far more unexpected, something that changes the way we think about creation itself. The ancient accounts describe a vast realm positioned above the earth, a realm connected to the structure and order of the universe, a place filled with mysteries that most people never even consider. It is not the throne room, it is not paradise, it is not the final destination, it is only the beginning. And that may be the greatest surprise of all, because before Enoch could see the glory of God, before he could witness paradise, Before he could approach the highest heavens, he first had to learn something about the hidden architecture of creation itself. And what he was about to see would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world above him, because the first thing Enoch saw was not heaven, as most people imagine it. And what awaited him there would forever change the way he understood the universe, and perhaps the way we understand it as well. As Enoch's journey continued, something remarkable began to unfold before him. The earth below was no longer the center of his attention. The familiar world of mountains, rivers, forests, and human cities seemed to fade into the distance. And for the first time, he found himself looking upon a realm that existed above ordinary human sight, a realm hidden beyond the clouds, beyond the blue sky, beyond everything most people imagine when they look upward. And what he discovered there was not paradise. Not yet. It was something far more surprising, something that challenged the very way ancient people understood creation itself. Whenever I think about this part of the journey, I find myself returning to a simple question: what exactly exists above us? Most of us spend our lives looking at the sky without giving it much thought. We see clouds, sunlight, storms, stars at night, and perhaps that seems sufficient. But the ancient biblical writers often described the heavens in ways that feel far, far more mysterious. They spoke of waters above the sky, of storehouses of snow and hail, of realms operating according to laws and purposes established by God long before humanity appeared on earth. And according to Enoch's account, the first heaven was closely connected to these hidden realities. The first thing that captured Enoch's attention was what many ancient traditions referred to as the cosmic waters, vast waters existing above the visible heavens, waters that ordinary human eyes could never perceive. At first, I struggled to understand this imagery, because modern people naturally think in terms of planets, galaxies, atmospheres, and scientific measurements. Yet the ancient world often described reality in a different language, a language that emphasized purpose, meaning, and divine order. The idea of waters above the heavens appears in the opening chapter of Genesis itself, where God separates the waters below from the waters above, creating the expanse we call the sky. For many readers, this verse passes by almost unnoticed. Yet Enoch's journey invites us to pause, to look more carefully, to ask what those ancient writers were trying to communicate. Because according to the vision, these heavenly waters were not merely decorative details. They formed part of the great architecture of creation, a reminder that the universe is sustained by God's power at every level. As Enoch gazed upon this realm, he began to understand something profound. Creation was not operating randomly. The world was not a machine left to function on its own. There was order, purpose, structure, and intelligence woven into every part of existence. And this realization became even more striking when he encountered the beings assigned to serve within this heavenly realm: angels. Not the mighty warrior angels often portrayed in popular imagination, not the archangels who appear carrying divine messages, but angels entrusted with responsibilities connected to the natural world itself. This is one of the details that fascinates me most, because it presents creation as something deeply personal. The winds, the rain, the changing seasons, the cycles of nature, all of it operating under divine oversight. Ancient traditions describe angels assigned to the snow, angels assigned to hail, angels responsible for winds, storms, mist, and lightning. Whether we understand these descriptions literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between, the message remains powerful. The natural world is not abandoned. It is governed, it is sustained, it is watched over. Every sunrise, every rainfall, every changing season becomes part of a larger story, a story pointing back to the Creator himself. Imagine Enoch standing there, observing these heavenly servants carrying out their assignments with perfect obedience. Unlike humanity, they did not struggle with divided loyalties. They did not question their purpose. They simply fulfilled the roles God had given them, day after day, age after age, serving faithfully within the structure of creation. And as I reflect on that image, I cannot help asking myself a difficult question. What would happen if human beings displayed even a fraction of that same consistency? How different would our lives become if we pursued God's purposes with the same devotion that these heavenly beings displayed? Yet perhaps the greatest lesson of the first heaven is not about angels at all. It is about God, because every detail Enoch witnessed seemed to reveal something about the character of the one who created it all. Nothing appeared chaotic, nothing appeared forgotten, nothing appeared neglected. Everything had a place, everything had a purpose, everything operated according to a design far greater than itself. And that realization carries enormous comfort, because if God governs the vast architecture of creation with such precision, if he sustains cosmic waters, heavenly realms, and countless unseen processes beyond human understanding, then surely he has not forgotten the details of our lives. Surely the God who oversees the movements of creation is not indifferent to the struggles of his people. The first heavens seem to declare that truth with remarkable clarity. God is present, God is attentive, God is still governing his creation. Yet, as extraordinary as this realm was, Enoch soon realized that it represented only the outermost layer of a much greater reality. He had not yet seen paradise, he had not yet approached the throne. What awaited him beyond the first heaven was something far more unsettling, because the next realm was not characterized by order, light, and faithful service. It was marked by darkness, imprisonment, and the consequences of rebellion. And what Enoch was about to witness there would reveal one of the most sobering truths in all of creation. The deeper Enoch traveled into the first heaven, the more he began to understand that creation was far more alive than he had ever imagined. What appeared from earth to be ordinary weather, shifting clouds, falling rain, winter snow, distant thunder, now revealed itself as part of an intricate heavenly order, a system established and sustained by God himself. And as I reflect on this part of Enoch's journey, I cannot help but think about how casually most of us experience the natural world. We check the weather forecast, we complain about rain, we enjoy a sunny afternoon, and rarely stop to wonder whether there is something greater happening behind the scenes. Yet, according to the ancient vision attributed to Enoch, there was, standing within the first heaven, Enoch observed beings assigned to specific responsibilities throughout creation. Not random forces, not blind mechanisms, but heavenly servants carrying out the commands of their Creator with unwavering obedience. Among them were angels associated with the winds, and this detail immediately captured my attention, because wind is one of the strangest realities in our world. We cannot see it, yet we see its effects everywhere. It bends trees, shapes oceans, carries storms across continents, and brings both life and destruction. Ancient people often viewed the wind with reverence because it seemed almost alive, moving with purpose, arriving unexpectedly, disappearing without explanation. In Enoch's account, the winds were not uncontrolled forces. They operated within boundaries established by God, attended by heavenly beings whose purpose was to carry out divine instruction. Imagine Enoch watching these angelic servants moving throughout the heavenly realm, directing currents and patterns that would eventually touch every corner of the earth below. Then his attention was drawn toward another wonder: snow. Now, perhaps this seems less dramatic to those who live in places where winter arrives every year, but for ancient people, snow was mysterious, beautiful, and often frightening. It transformed entire landscapes overnight, covering mountains, forests, and valleys in brilliant white silence. The book of Job contains a fascinating question spoken by God himself. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Every time I encounter that verse, I find myself wondering whether there is more to it than poetry, because Enoch's vision suggests that behind the snow existed heavenly order, heavenly purpose, and heavenly administration. Angels assigned to tasks beyond human observation, faithfully serving the Creator who governs every season. Yet snow was only one part of what Enoch witnessed. He also encountered references to hail, another force of nature that appears throughout Scripture in moments of both judgment and power. Hailstorms can devastate fields, shatter structures, and alter entire landscapes within minutes. To ancient observers, hail was not merely weather, it was a reminder of forces beyond human control. Enoch's account describes heavenly beings connected with these storehouses of hail, guardians of powers that remain dormant until called into action according to divine purpose. And once again, the message becomes clear. Creation is not abandoned to chance. It remains under authority, under oversight, under the sovereign rule of God. But perhaps the most awe-inspiring aspect of this realm involved thunder and lightning. Even today, thousands of years later, thunder still has the ability to make us pause. A sudden flash of light splitting the darkness, followed by a roar powerful enough to shake windows and rattle the ground beneath our feet. There is something primal about that experience, hence, something that reminds us how small we truly are. Throughout Scripture, thunder is often associated with the voice of God, with divine majesty, with heavenly power breaking into human awareness. And according to Enoch's vision, there were heavenly servants involved even here, angels carrying out responsibilities connected to storms, lightning, and the tremendous energies woven into creation. As I imagine Enoch standing among these realities, one thought keeps returning to me: obedience. Because every angel he encountered in the first heaven seemed united by a single purpose. They served without hesitation. They fulfilled their assignments without complaint. They operated in harmony with the will of God, and that creates a striking contrast with humanity. While people often resist God's direction, question his wisdom, or pursue their own paths, these heavenly servants remained faithful to their purpose. Age after age, season after season, generation after generation, their consistency became a testimony to the order of heaven itself. Yet, I do not think Enoch was shown these things merely to satisfy curiosity. The deeper lesson appears to be something far more personal. Every gust of wind, every snowfall, every storm, every flash of lightning becomes a reminder that God remains actively involved in his creation. Nothing exists beyond his knowledge. Nothing unfolds outside his authority. The same God who governs cosmic waters, heavenly realms, and the forces of nature is also aware of every detail of our lives, every fear, every prayer, every struggle, every moment of uncertainty. And perhaps that is what struck Enoch most deeply as he stood in the first heaven. The universe was not a machine operating on its own. It was a kingdom, ordered, governed, and sustained by the living God. But even as that realization filled him with wonder, another reality waited ahead, a reality very different from the harmony he had just witnessed. Because beyond the faithful angels of wind and storm, beyond the ordered beauty of creation, there existed a realm where obedience had been abandoned, where rebellion had taken root, and where the consequences of that rebellion still echoed through the heavens. And what Enoch was about to see next would replace wonder with something far more unsettling. The longer Enoch remained within the first heaven, the more a single truth began to emerge from everything he was seeing. Nothing here was accidental. Nothing was chaotic. Nothing was drifting aimlessly through existence. Everywhere he looked, there was order, purpose, structure, and authority. And if I am being honest, this may be one of the most important lessons in the entire journey. Because when most of us look at the world around us, chaos often seems easier to find than order. We see wars, disasters, suffering, uncertainty. We watch nations rise and fall, economies fluctuate, relationships break apart, plans collapse, and dreams disappear. Sometimes it can feel as though the world is spinning without direction, as though events are unfolding randomly, disconnected from any greater purpose. But standing within the first heaven, Enoch was shown a completely different perspective. He was seeing creation from above, from the vantage point of heaven rather than earth. And from that perspective, order appeared everywhere. The winds moved according to assignment. The waters remained within boundaries. The seasons arrived at their appointed times. The angels fulfilled their responsibilities with unwavering faithfulness. Nothing seemed confused. Nothing seemed forgotten. Everything operated under the authority of the Creator. As I imagine Enoch witnessing these realities, I cannot help but think about how different this view must have been from life on Earth. Down below, human beings struggled with fear, uncertainty, conflict, and temptation. Yet above, creation continued to function according to the purposes established by God from the very beginning. It is almost as though heaven was revealing a truth that humanity often forgets. Just because we do not understand what is happening does not mean God has lost control. This lesson appears throughout Scripture, again and again. God reveals himself as the one who establishes order in places where human beings see only confusion. In the opening chapter of Genesis, God brings order out of chaos, separating light from darkness, land from sea, day from night. Throughout the biblical story, we see the same pattern repeated. God governs history, directs nations, fulfills promises, and accomplishes his purposes even when circumstances appear impossible. And here in the first heaven, Enoch was being shown that this divine order extends far beyond human history. It reaches into the very structure of creation itself. Every movement, every cycle, every force of nature ultimately exists under God's authority. And perhaps this is why the first heaven feels so different from the realms that will come later. Because here, Enoch encounters the original design, a glimpse of creation functioning exactly as it was intended to function. The angels obey, the boundaries hold, the assignments are fulfilled, the order remains intact. There is a kind of peace in that vision, a reminder that beneath the noise and confusion of earthly life, a greater reality continues to operate. Yet, as comforting as that thought may be, it also raises a personal question. What does this mean for us? Because it is one thing to admire heavenly order, it is another thing entirely to allow that truth to shape our lives. And this is where I believe Enoch's experience becomes deeply relevant. You see, many of us spend enormous amounts of energy worrying about things we cannot control. We worry about tomorrow. We worry about outcomes. We worry about situations that seem completely beyond our influence. I know I have done it myself. There are moments when uncertainty feels overwhelming, moments when it seems impossible to understand what God is doing. Yet the first heaven offers a gentle reminder. The God who governs creation has not abandoned his throne. The God who established the boundaries of the seas, who directs the seasons, who sustains the stars, is still at work, even when we cannot see it, even when we do not understand it. His authority remains unchanged. That does not mean life becomes easy. It does not mean suffering disappears. But it does mean that chaos never has the final word. Behind every uncertainty stands a God whose purposes are larger than our perspective. And perhaps that is why Enoch needed to see this realm before continuing his journey. Before he could witness judgment, before he could encounter paradise, before he could approach the throne itself, he first needed to understand that heaven is not governed by confusion. Heaven is governed by order. Everything else in the journey rests upon that foundation. Because if God is not sovereign, then none of the later revelations would matter. But if he truly governs all things, then every part of creation, visible and invisible, exists within his authority. And that realization changes everything. It changes the way we view our struggles. It changes the way we view our future. It changes the way we understand God's presence in the world. Yet, even as Enoch absorbed this profound lesson, another reality waited beyond the first heaven, a reality that stood in stark contrast to the harmony he had just witnessed. Because if the first heaven revealed what obedience looks like, the next realm would reveal the consequences of rebellion. If the first heaven displayed order, the next would expose the tragedy that unfolds when created beings reject the authority of the one who made them. And what Enoch was about to encounter there would be unlike anything he had seen before. For beyond the light of the first heaven, beyond the faithful angels and the beauty of divine order, There existed a place where sorrow, judgment, and darkness waited in silence. As Enoch prepared to leave the first heaven behind, I imagine there must have been a sense of peace within him. After all, everything he had witnessed so far pointed toward harmony. The cosmic waters remained within their appointed boundaries. The angels fulfilled their assignments with unwavering faithfulness. Creation moved according to divine order. Everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of God's wisdom, God's authority, God's care. But then something changed. And this change was not subtle, it was immediate, profound, and deeply unsettling. The further Enoch moved from the realm of light and order, the more he sensed that he was approaching something entirely different. I often picture this moment as standing at the edge of a great valley just before sunset. When the light begins to fade, when familiar shapes become shadows, when an unexplainable feeling settles into the air. The first heaven had been filled with activity, movement, purpose, but now the atmosphere itself seemed heavier. The brightness that surrounded him began to diminish. The sense of harmony he had experienced started to give way to something else, something difficult to describe, something that felt ancient, sorrowful, and deeply wounded. And as I reflect on this transition, it strikes me how often Scripture uses light and darkness not merely as physical realities, but as spiritual symbols. Light reveals, darkness conceals, light brings life, darkness often accompanies judgment. Yet the darkness Enoch was approaching was not simply the absence of light, it was the presence of a tragedy so significant that its consequences continued to echo throughout the heavens themselves. As he crossed into the second heaven, the atmosphere changed completely. The songs of faithful angels were gone. The ordered beauty of creation seemed far away. In their place was silence, a silence unlike anything he had experienced before. Not the peaceful silence of a calm evening, not the comforting stillness of prayer. This was a heavy silence, a silence that seemed burdened by grief, by regret, by the weight of something broken beyond repair. And then the darkness appeared, not ordinary darkness, not simply the absence of sunlight. This darkness felt alive with sorrow. It seemed to carry the memory of rebellion, the memory of choices that had altered the course of history. The deeper Enoch ventured into this realm, the more he realized that he was entering a place very different from anything he had previously encountered. Whenever I think about this scene, I find myself asking an uncomfortable question. What could possibly exist in heaven that would produce such overwhelming grief? After everything Enoch had seen, after the beauty of divine order, after the faithfulness of the heavenly servants, what kind of reality could create an atmosphere like this? The answer was not immediately revealed. Instead, Enoch was forced to experience the tension, to feel the weight of the place before fully understanding its purpose. And perhaps that is exactly how some truths must be encountered, not merely explained, but felt. The deeper he moved into the shadows, the more he became aware that this was not a place of freedom. It was a place of confinement, a place where something or someone was being held, waiting, existing in a state of suspension, neither forgotten nor released. The very air seemed to testify to the seriousness of what had happened here. Every step carried a sense of anticipation. Every moment seemed to whisper that a great mystery was about to be uncovered. And as I imagine, standing beside Enoch, I can almost feel the tension building, because we naturally expect heaven to be a place of joy, of peace, of glory. Yet here, within the second heaven, we encounter something entirely different. A prison beyond the light, a realm that serves as a reminder that even in the spiritual world, choices carry consequences, that rebellion is not without cost, that freedom can be lost, and still, Enoch had not yet seen the prisoners. He had not yet learned their names. He had not yet discovered why this place existed. All he knew was that the darkness was growing deeper, the silence heavier, and the sorrow more intense. Then, somewhere within that shadowed realm, he began to perceive figures, shapes emerging from the darkness. ancient beings, powerful beings, beings whose story would help explain some of the greatest mysteries in all of Scripture. And what Enoch was about to witness would shake him in a way that the beauty of the first heaven never could, because hidden within that darkness, imprisoned beyond the light, were beings whose fall had changed the course of history, beings whose faces carried the unbearable weight of regret, beings whose fate served as an eternal warning to all creation. And when Enoch finally saw who was being held there, when he looked into their eyes and understood what they had lost, the sight would move him to tears. The deeper Enoch moved into the darkness of the second heaven, the more he realized that this was not merely a place of shadows, it was a place of judgment, a place where the consequences of rebellion could be seen with terrifying clarity. The harmony of the first heaven was now far behind him. The faithful angels tending creation, the cosmic waters, the ordered beauty of God's design, all of it seemed distant. Here, everything felt different. The silence was heavier, the atmosphere colder, and beneath it all lingered an overwhelming sense of loss. Not the loss of something small, but the loss of something magnificent, something that had once stood in the presence of God Himself. As I imagine Enoch standing in that realm, I cannot help but wonder what was going through his mind, because the figures emerging from the darkness were unlike anything he had ever seen. These were not human beings. They were not mortal souls awaiting judgment. They were angels, fallen angels, ancient beings who had once known the glory of heaven, who had once stood among the servants of God, who had once participated in the divine order Enoch had just witnessed in the first heaven. And yet, here they were, imprisoned, broken, waiting. The sight alone must have been staggering. We often think of angels as symbols of power, purity, and divine authority. Scripture frequently presents them as mighty messengers, warriors, guardians, beings whose presence causes even the strongest people to tremble. But now Enoch was seeing another side of the story, a tragedy hidden behind the glory, the reality that even heavenly beings possessed the freedom to choose, and some of them had chosen rebellion. According to the ancient traditions surrounding Enoch's vision, these fallen angels were not merely being punished, they were being held, confined within a realm of darkness, awaiting a judgment that had not yet fully arrived. Their imprisonment was not temporary, nor was it symbolic. It represented a profound spiritual reality, a warning woven into the structure of the heavens themselves. The Book of Enoch describes these beings as carrying immense sorrow, their faces marked by grief, their presence overshadowed by regret. They knew what they had lost, they remembered the glory they once possessed, and perhaps that memory was part of their punishment, to know what it means to stand near God and then be forever separated from that presence. Whenever I think about that image, I find it deeply unsettling. Not because it is dramatic, but because it reveals something about the seriousness of rebellion. In our world, people often treat sin as something trivial, something easily ignored, something without lasting consequences. Yet the second heaven tells a very different story. It reveals that choices matter, that rebellion carries a cost, that turning away from God always leads somewhere. And nowhere is that lesson more vividly displayed than in the prison of the fallen angels. What makes this vision even more fascinating is that its themes echo beyond the Book of Enoch itself. The New Testament contains passages that seem to point toward the same reality. In his letter, Jude speaks of angels who did not remain within their proper position, angels who abandoned the place assigned to them. He describes them as being kept in darkness. Thus bound for judgment, waiting for the day when God's final verdict will be revealed. Likewise, the Apostle Peter writes of angels who sinned, angels who were delivered into chains of darkness, reserved for judgment. Every time I encounter those passages, I find myself pausing, because whether one approaches them from a theological perspective, a historical perspective, or simply as part of the biblical narrative, they point toward a shared idea. There exists a realm where certain fallen beings are being held, a realm connected to divine justice, a realm that Enoch claims to have witnessed firsthand. And as Enoch stood among these imprisoned beings, he was not filled with triumph. He was not celebrating their downfall. Instead, the ancient account suggests something far more human. He felt sorrow, deep sorrow, because he understood that these were not insignificant creatures. These were beings who had once known unimaginable glory, beings who had once fulfilled meaningful roles within God's creation. Yet through pride, disobedience, and rebellion, they had lost everything. There is something profoundly tragic about that, and perhaps that is why Enoch's reaction becomes so important. Rather than responding with hatred, he responded with grief. Because when we truly understand the consequences of separation from God, sorrow becomes a natural response, not because justice is wrong, but because the loss is so immense. The second heaven, therefore, serves as more than a prison. It serves as a warning, a monument to the consequences of abandoning the purposes for which one was created. Every chain, every shadow, every expression of regret seems to declare the same message. Freedom is precious. Obedience matters. The presence of God is not something to take lightly. Yet even as Enoch struggled to process what he was seeing, another realization was beginning to emerge. These fallen angels were not merely prisoners. They were connected to a much larger story, a story involving humanity, corruption, pride, and choices that would ultimately affect the entire world. And the deeper Enoch looked into their faces, the more he began to understand the devastating consequences of their rebellion, consequences that reached far beyond the walls of this prison, consequences that would help explain some of the darkest chapters in human history. And what he was about to learn next would reveal why the fall of these angels remains one of the most sobering warnings ever preserved in ancient tradition. Standing within the shadowed prison of the second heaven, Enoch was no longer looking merely at the consequences of judgment. He was looking at the consequences of choice. And the deeper he reflected on what he was seeing, the more one truth became impossible to ignore. None of these beings were created for darkness. None of them were created for chains. None of them were created for sorrow. They had arrived here because of rebellion. Because somewhere in the distant past, a choice had been made, a choice that altered destinies, disrupted creation, left scars that stretched far beyond the walls of this prison. Whenever I think about this part of the journey, my mind inevitably returns to one of the most mysterious figures in all of Scripture, Lucifer. The being traditionally associated with the Great Rebellion against God, the one whose story has fascinated believers for centuries. Yet what makes the story so powerful is not how it ended, it is how it began. According to the biblical imagery found in passages such as Isaiah and Ezekiel, Lucifer is portrayed as a being of extraordinary beauty, wisdom, and privilege, a being who occupied a position of remarkable honor, existing in the presence of God, surrounded by glory, entrusted with responsibilities beyond human comprehension. If these descriptions point toward the being later identified as Satan, then the tragedy becomes even more profound, because this was not a creature seeking God and being rejected. This was a creature already surrounded by divine glory. And yet, somehow that was not enough. Every time I reflect on that possibility, I find it deeply unsettling, because it reveals something important about the nature of rebellion. Rebellion does not begin with weakness. It begins with pride. Pride is one of those dangers that often appears small at first. It whispers rather than shouts. It convinces us that we deserve more, that we know better, that we no longer need the guidance of the one who created us. It transforms gratitude into entitlement, dependence into self-sufficiency, humility into self-exaltation, and according to the ancient story, pride became the seed from which the great rebellion grew. Imagine the moment. A being created to reflect God's glory begins to focus instead on his own. A servant begins to desire the throne. A created being begins to challenge the creator. What begins as an internal corruption eventually becomes open rebellion, and rebellion always carries consequences. The second heaven stands as a testimony to that reality. The fallen angels Enoch encountered were not there because God had failed them. They were there because they had abandoned the purpose for which they were created. The tragedy was not merely punishment. The tragedy was loss. They had lost the privilege of serving in the presence of God. They had lost the harmony of their original design. They had lost the joy that comes from alignment with divine purpose. And perhaps most painful of all, they understood exactly what they had lost. That is what makes their imprisonment so haunting. They remembered the glory, the beauty, the closeness, the light. They knew what existed beyond the darkness because they had once lived within it. Whenever I imagine Enoch looking into their faces, I picture him seeing more than prisoners. I picture him seeing a warning that rebellion never delivers what it promises. Pride promises freedom, yet often produces bondage. Pride promises elevation, yet frequently results in downfall. Pride promises control, yet ultimately leads to loss. This pattern repeats itself throughout human history. Kingdoms rise through arrogance and collapse through the same arrogance. Individuals pursue power, wealth, recognition, only to discover that none of these things can satisfy the deepest needs of the soul. The story of rebellion is not merely an ancient story about fallen angels. It is a mirror reflecting a temptation every generation faces. The temptation to place ourselves at the center, the temptation to trust our own wisdom above God's, the temptation to pursue our own glory rather than His. And this is why the second heaven feels so personal. Because Enoch is not merely being shown the fate of ancient beings, he is being shown the ultimate destination of every path that leads away from God. Not because God delights in judgment, but because separation from the source of life inevitably produces darkness. Yet even in the midst of this sobering reality, another truth begins to emerge. The existence of judgment itself reveals that God takes moral choices seriously. Our decisions matter, our faithfulness matters, our obedience matters. The universe is not indifferent to how we live. Every act of loyalty, every act of rebellion, every choice to trust or reject God carries significance. And as Enoch stood among the imprisoned angels, surrounded by the consequences of pride, he was learning one of the most difficult lessons in all of creation: that greatness without humility leads to destruction, that privilege without gratitude leads to corruption, that power without submission leads to ruin. But even as he absorbed these truths, another mystery remained unanswered. Because the story of the fallen angels was not only about rebellion, it was also connected to humanity itself, to paradise, to judgment, to the destiny awaiting every soul after death. And as Enoch prepared to continue his ascent beyond the darkness of the second heaven, he was about to encounter a realm unlike anything he had seen before, a realm where beauty and sorrow, hope and warning, comfort and consequence existed side by side, a place that would answer one of the oldest questions ever asked by the human heart. What happens when we die? After leaving behind the darkness of the second heaven, after witnessing the prison of the fallen angels and the devastating consequences of rebellion, Enoch continued his ascent, and as he moved farther from that realm of sorrow, something began to change once again. The heaviness that had surrounded him started to lift. The oppressive darkness slowly receded. The silence that had felt like a burden upon the soul gave way to something entirely different, something brighter, something warmer, something filled with life. If the second heaven had revealed the cost of turning away from God, the third heaven was about to reveal the beauty of drawing near to Him. And what Enoch encountered there would answer one of the oldest questions humanity has ever asked: what happens after death? I often think about how deeply this question touches every human heart, across every culture, every generation, every civilization. People have stood beside graves and wondered, where did they go? What exists beyond the final breath? Is there truly a place prepared for the faithful? And according to the ancient vision attributed to Enoch, the answer was not merely theoretical. It was something he was allowed to witness firsthand. As he entered the third heaven, The first thing that struck him was beauty, not ordinary beauty, not the beauty of mountains, oceans, or sunsets. Beautiful as those things may be, this was something greater, a beauty that seemed untouched by decay, untouched by sorrow, untouched by time itself. Enoch described a magnificent garden, a place overflowing with life, abundance, and peace. Whenever I imagine this scene, I picture a landscape unlike anything found on Earth. Trees filled with vibrant splendor, their branches heavy with fruit, their leaves radiant with life, flowers of extraordinary beauty stretching across the landscape, rivers flowing through the garden, not merely with water, but with symbols of abundance. Rivers associated with honey, with richness, with blessing. The very atmosphere seemed saturated with goodness. Every detail appeared to communicate the same message. This place was prepared. This place was intentional. This place belonged to God. And perhaps what fascinates me most is that Enoch does not simply describe physical beauty, he describes presence, because beyond the trees, beyond the rivers, beyond the splendor of the garden itself, there was something even more remarkable: the nearness of God. The unmistakable awareness that the Creator's presence rested upon this realm. Everything about the garden reflected his goodness, his peace, his holiness. It was not merely a location, it was a place defined by relationship, a place where separation had ended, a place where those who belonged to God experienced rest in his presence. Whenever I reflect on this part of the journey, I am reminded of Jesus' words to the thief on the cross. Today, you will be with me in paradise. Not someday, not after endless uncertainty, but today. Those words carry extraordinary comfort because they suggest that paradise is not simply a distant future hope. It is a real destination, a real reality, a real place prepared by God. And according to Enoch's vision, this paradise existed within the third heaven. Yet what makes this realm even more profound is the contrast that exists within it, because the third heaven was not only a place of comfort, it was also a place of separation, a place where two destinies existed side by side. While Enoch gazed upon the beauty of paradise, he also became aware that another region existed within the same realm, a region marked not by peace, but by sorrow, not by joy, but by regret, not by the presence of God, but by the consequences of rejecting him. The contrast could not have been greater. On one side, life, hope, rest, and divine presence. On the other, darkness, loss, and separation. And perhaps this is one of the most sobering realities Enoch encountered during his entire journey, because it revealed that eternity is not merely about existence. It is about destination. It is about relationship. It is about the choices made while life still remains. The beauty of paradise was made even more beautiful by the awareness of what existed beyond it. Just as light shines brightest against darkness, paradise appeared even more glorious when contrasted with the sorrow of separation. Yet Enoch's attention remained fixed upon the garden, upon the rivers, upon the life flowing through every part of this extraordinary realm. And the more he observed, the more one truth became clear. Paradise was not beautiful because of its scenery alone. It was beautiful because God was there. His presence transformed everything. His nearness gave meaning to every river, every tree, every moment of peace. Because at the deepest level, paradise is not simply about where we are, it is about who we are with. And that realization may be one of the greatest gifts Enoch carried from the third heaven. Yet, even as he stood in wonder before this extraordinary realm, another question lingered. Because if paradise and separation both existed within the third heaven, what determined where a soul would awaken after death? What created the divide between comfort and sorrow? What separated one destiny from another? And as Enoch continued exploring this realm, he was about to encounter an answer so profound, so personal, and so urgent that it would forever change the way he understood eternity itself. As Enoch continued his journey through the third heaven, the beauty of paradise remained before him. The rivers flowed with abundance, the trees stood radiant with life, the atmosphere itself seemed filled with peace. Yet the more he explored this realm, the more he became aware that paradise was only part of the story. Because within the same heavenly domain, another reality existed, a reality far less comforting, a reality that revealed one of the most sobering truths about eternity. And it is here that my thoughts are often drawn to a story told centuries later by Jesus himself, the story of Lazarus and the rich man, because whether viewed as a parable, a revelation, or a glimpse into spiritual reality, the themes echo powerfully with what Enoch was witnessing. Jesus described two men. One was poor, covered in sores, ignored by the world. His name was Lazarus. The other was wealthy, comfortable, respected, clothed in luxury and surrounded by abundance. Yet when death came, everything changed. The poor man was carried to a place of comfort, while the rich man found himself in a place of torment. And what makes the story so striking is not merely that their destinies were different, it is that they were aware of one another. They existed within the same broader realm, stress realm, separated not by distance, but by something far more profound, a divide, a boundary, a fixed chasm. As I imagine Enoch standing within the third heaven, I cannot help but think of that image, because the vision before him reflected a similar reality. On one side, peace, comfort, hope, and the presence of God. On the other, sorrow, regret, longing, and separation. The contrast was impossible to ignore, and perhaps that is precisely why it was shown to him, not to inspire fear alone, but to reveal the significance of human choices. We often live as though eternity is distant, as though the decisions we make today have little connection to what lies beyond death. Yet the third heaven reveals a very different perspective. It suggests that our lives are moving toward destinations, that our choices matter, that relationship with God matters. That eternity is not merely an abstract idea, but a reality toward which every human being is traveling. The image of the fixed chasm has always fascinated me, because in the story Jesus told, the rich man could see the place of comfort, he could recognize what existed beyond the divide, yet he could not cross it. The separation was permanent, established, unchangeable, and as sobering as that reality may be, it reveals something important about judgment. Judgment is not arbitrary, it is not random, it is the final confirmation of choices already made. The fixed chasm represents a boundary that can no longer be altered, a destiny that has become settled, a path whose direction was determined long before arrival. Whenever I reflect on that truth, I find myself asking an uncomfortable question. What truly separates these two destinies? Is it wealth, status, achievement, intelligence? The answer seems to be none of these. The deeper issue is relationship, trust, alignment with God. The poor man in Jesus' story possessed little in the eyes of the world, yet he awakened in comfort. The rich man possessed everything the world admired, yet found himself separated from the very thing that mattered most. This lesson would not have been lost on Enoch, because his own life had been defined by relationship with God, not by power, not by wealth, not by earthly success. The reason Enoch's story endures is not because he accumulated greatness, it is because he walked with God. And now, standing within the third heaven, he was witnessing the eternal significance of that choice. Yet, even within this sobering revelation, hope remained visible. Paradise was real, the presence of God was real, rest was real, comfort was real. The beauty surrounding Enoch was not an illusion. It was a promise, a reminder that God's desire is not destruction, but restoration, not separation, but reconciliation. The garden, the rivers, the peace, all pointed toward the goodness of the Creator, a goodness available to those who choose to walk with Him. But as profound as the lessons of the third heaven were, Enoch's journey was far from complete. In fact, he was about to leave behind the realm of destiny and enter something entirely different. Up to this point, he had seen creation, judgment, paradise, and separation. Yet ahead of him lay a realm overflowing with light, a realm where heavenly worship never ceased, a realm where celestial bodies moved according to divine purpose, a realm filled with glory, praise, and awe. The shadows of the second heaven were behind him. The divided destinies of the third heaven were now fading into the distance. And as he continued ascending, Enoch began to perceive a radiance unlike anything he had encountered before, a brilliance growing stronger with every step, a light that seemed to pulse with life itself. And what awaited him there would reveal a side of heaven not defined by judgment, but by worship, not by separation, but by adoration. For Enoch was about to enter a realm where every movement, every voice, and every celestial wonder existed for one purpose alone, to glorify the Creator of all things. As Enoch left behind the great divide of the third heaven, the atmosphere around him began to change once more. The questions of judgment, destiny, paradise, and separation floated into the distance, not because they were unimportant, but because another revelation now waited before him, a revelation so vast, so magnificent, that it would transform the way he understood the universe itself. The further he ascended, the brighter everything became. Light seemed to fill every direction, not the harsh light of fire, nor the fading light of dawn, but a radiant brilliance that appeared alive, purposeful, and endlessly sustained. It was as though Enoch was approaching the beating heart of creation's rhythm, the place where the heavens themselves proclaimed the glory of God. Whenever I imagine this moment, I picture Enoch looking upward and seeing something beyond human expectation. Because what awaited him in the fourth heaven was not a throne, not yet. It was not the highest realm nor the final destination of his journey. Instead, it was a realm dedicated to order, movement, and worship, a place where the great lights of the heavens fulfilled the roles assigned to them by their Creator. Here, Enoch encountered realities that every human being has seen, yet few have ever truly considered. The sun, the moon, and the stars. We see them every day. We measure time by them. We navigate by them. We admire their beauty. Yet how often do we stop and ask why they exist? How often do we consider what they reveal about the character of the one who placed them in the heavens? For Enoch, these were no longer distant objects in the sky. They became living testimonies to God's wisdom and authority. The first thing that captured his attention was the sun, magnificent, radiant, overwhelming in its brilliance. Ancient traditions associated with Enoch describe the sun moving according to divinely established paths, never wandering, never losing its course, never forgetting its purpose, day after day, year after year, century after century. It fulfilled the assignment given to it at creation. And as I reflect on this image, I find moving because the sun never seeks recognition. It never asks for praise. It simply does what it was created to do, faithfully, consistently, without deviation. Imagine Enoch watching this celestial giant moving through the heavens, not randomly, but according to divine order, every sunrise becoming an act of obedience, every sunset a testimony to God's faithfulness. Then his attention shifted toward the moon, softer, quieter, yet no less remarkable. Unlike the blazing power of the sun, the moon reflected light, illuminating darkness without producing its own brilliance. There is something beautiful about that image, because it reminds us that not every calling requires us to generate greatness ourselves. Sometimes our purpose is simply to reflect the glory of the one who gives us light. As Enoch observed the moon fulfilling its appointed cycles, waxing and waning according to patterns established by God, he saw yet another example of heavenly order. Nothing was random, nothing was accidental. Every phase served a purpose. Every movement contributed to a greater harmony. Yet perhaps the most breathtaking sight of all was the stars. Countless stars, stretching beyond imagination, filling the heavens with beauty, mystery, and wonder. Whenever I step outside on a clear night and look upward, I am reminded of how small we truly are. But imagine Enoch seeing the stars not from Earth, but from within the heavenly realm itself, seeing them as part of a grand cosmic design, each one occupying its assigned place, each one moving according to laws established by the Creator. Ancient people often viewed the stars as symbols of divine order, reminders that the universe operates according to a wisdom far beyond human understanding. And standing within the fourth heaven, Enoch saw that truth on a scale he had never imagined. The sun, the moon, and the stars were not competing with one another. They were cooperating. Together they formed a celestial symphony, a great cosmic orchestra performing the will of God through their faithful existence. And this may be one of the most profound lessons of the fourth heaven. Worship is not limited to words. Worship is not confined to songs. Worship is not merely something spoken. Sometimes worship is expressed through faithful obedience. The sun worships by shining, the moon worships by reflecting, the stars worship by remaining in their appointed places. Everything in creation fulfills its purpose as an act of praise to the one who made it. As Enoch watched these celestial wonders, I believe he was beginning to understand something extraordinary. The universe itself was engaged in worship, not forced worship, not reluctant worship, but joyful participation in the order established by God. Every movement, every cycle, every orbit testified to his wisdom. Yet, even amid the beauty of this cosmic harmony, Enoch sensed that there was something more, because while the sun, moon, and stars revealed God's power, another revelation awaited him deeper within the fourth heaven, a revelation involving the heavenly beings who accompanied these celestial lights, beings whose voices never ceased, beings whose purpose was not merely to maintain order, but to celebrate the glory of the Creator without end. And what Enoch was about to hear would reveal that all of creation, from the smallest star to the greatest heavenly host, was united by a single purpose: to worship the living God. As Enoch stood within the radiant expanse of the fourth heaven, surrounded by the majesty of the sun, the quiet beauty of the moon, and the countless stars stretching into eternity, he began to notice something he had not fully understood before. The heavens were not silent. They had never been silent. From the earth below, the movements of the celestial bodies appeared peaceful, distant, almost motionless. But from within the heavenly realm itself, Enoch discovered that every movement was accompanied by worship. Every orbit, every cycle, every rising and setting existed within a symphony of praise directed toward the Creator. And what fascinated him most was not the celestial bodies themselves, but the beings who accompanied them. The ancient traditions describe angels assigned to these heavenly lights, attendants of the sun, guardians of appointed times, servants whose role extended beyond administration into worship. Whenever I reflect on this scene, I find myself imagining Enoch looking toward the path of the sun and realizing that what appeared from earth to be a solitary journey was actually far more glorious. Far more glorious. The sun did not travel alone. It moved within an environment alive with praise. Heavenly beings accompanied its course, not because the sun required protection, but because every aspect of creation ultimately existed to glorify God. Imagine witnessing that sight, the great blazing sun moving faithfully across the heavens, while around it countless angelic voices lifted songs of worship that never ceased. Songs not driven by obligation, not motivated by fear, but flowing naturally from awe, gratitude, and love for the one who created all things. The more Enoch listened, the more he realized that worship in heaven was very different from worship on earth. On earth, worship often comes and goes. People gather for a time, sing for a while, pray for a season, and then return to the concerns of daily life. But here, worship was constant, unbroken, endless, like a river that never runs dry. Every moment carried praise, every movement reflected adoration. Every part of creation participated in glorifying its maker. I often wonder what that must have sounded like, not merely music, not simply voices, but something far greater, a harmony woven into the very fabric of existence, a sound so pure, so beautiful, so complete that human language struggles to describe it. The ancient accounts speak of songs, declarations, praises rising continually before God. Yet I suspect the reality was even more extraordinary than words can capture. because these heavenly beings were not singing about something they had heard. They were worshiping someone they knew, someone they saw, someone whose glory surrounded them constantly. And perhaps that is what makes their worship so powerful. It was not based on faith alone, it was based on direct experience of God's majesty. Every moment they spent in his presence deepened their understanding of his greatness. Every glimpse of his wisdom inspired fresh praise. Every revelation of his goodness gave birth to new songs. There was no boredom in heaven, no repetition devoid of meaning, because the glory of God is infinite, and an infinite God continually reveals new reasons for worship. As Enoch listened to this heavenly chorus, I believe he began to understand something important about the purpose of creation itself. We often think of the universe as existing for us, the stars for our wonder, the sun for our warmth, the moon for our beauty. Yet the fourth heaven revealed a much larger reality. Creation exists first and foremost for the glory of God. The sun shines because God commands it. The stars remain in place because God sustains them. The angels worship because they recognize his worth. Everything ultimately points back to him, and this realization changes the way we see our own lives. Because if the sun fulfills its purpose through faithful obedience, if the stars glorify God by remaining where they were placed, if the angels worship continuously because they understand who God is, then perhaps our greatest purpose is not so different. Perhaps the deepest fulfillment we can ever experience comes from aligning our lives with the one who created us. Just as Enoch walked with God on earth, every human being is invited into that same relationship, not necessarily into heavenly visions, but into daily fellowship, daily trust, daily worship. Yet there was another detail that struck Enoch as he observed this realm. None of the angels seemed concerned with themselves. None sought attention. None competed for recognition. All focus was directed toward God. The center of worship was never the worshipers. It was always the one being worshiped. And in a world so often consumed with self-promotion, self-glory, and personal achievement, that lesson feels especially powerful. True worship shifts our attention away from ourselves and toward the Creator. The more Enoch witnessed this endless song, the more he understood that worship is not merely something heaven does. Worship is what heaven is. It is the natural response of every being who fully understands who God is. Yet even within this realm of light and praise, another mystery awaited him, because not every angel he would encounter carried the same joyful song. Beyond the radiant worship of the fourth heaven, there existed another group of heavenly beings. Watchers who had remained faithful, watchers who had witnessed rebellion among their own kind, watchers who carried a sorrow unlike anything Enoch had yet encountered. And as he prepared to move deeper into the heavenly realms, he was about to discover that even in heaven, faithfulness can come with a cost, and loyalty to God can sometimes be accompanied by profound grief. As the endless songs of the fourth heaven gradually faded behind him, Enoch continued his ascent into realms even higher. The radiant worship, the celestial harmony, the angelic voices accompanying the sun and stars had revealed a heaven overflowing with joy. Yet, the deeper he traveled, the more he discovered that heaven was not simply a place of celebration. It was also a place of memory, a place where loyalty, faithfulness, and loss carried profound meaning. And it was here, within what many ancient traditions describe as the fifth heaven, that Enoch encountered a group unlike any he had seen before. They were not imprisoned like the fallen angels of the second heaven, nor were they caught up in the triumphant worship of the fourth. They stood somewhere between sorrow and faithfulness, between grief and obedience. These were the watchers who had remained loyal to God, the faithful watchers. Whenever I first encountered this part of Enoch's journey, I expected another realm filled with glory, another vision of heavenly beauty. But what struck me instead was the emotional weight of the place. There was no rebellion here, no chains, no darkness. Yet there was sadness, a quiet sadness, the kind of sadness that comes not from personal failure, but from witnessing the downfall of those you once knew. Imagine for a moment beings who had existed together for ages beyond human comprehension, serving side by side, sharing responsibilities, participating in the order of heaven, and then watching some among them choose a different path, watching pride take root, watching rebellion spread, watching brothers fall. The faithful watchers had not joined the rebellion. They had remained loyal, yet they carried the sorrow of witnessing what had happened. And perhaps that is why this realm feels so different from the others, because grief is not always the result of personal guilt. Sometimes grief comes from love. Sometimes grief comes from watching others destroy themselves. Sometimes grief comes from seeing what could have been. As Enoch observed these faithful watchers, he noticed that they were not celebrating the judgment of the fallen. They were mourning it, not because justice was wrong, but because the loss was so great. They understood better than anyone what the fallen angels had once been. They remembered the glory those beings had enjoyed. They remembered the purpose they had once fulfilled. They remembered a time before rebellion entered their ranks. Every time I reflect on this scene, I find it deeply moving because it reveals something important about the heart of heaven. Heaven does not rejoice in destruction. Heaven rejoices in righteousness. There is a difference. The faithful watchers did not take pleasure in the downfall of others. Instead, they seem to embody the sorrow that accompanies lost potential, lost purpose, and lost relationship with God. In many ways, their grief mirrors something we experience on earth. Most of us know what it feels like to watch someone we care about make destructive choices. We know the helplessness of seeing a friend abandon wisdom. We know the pain of watching a loved one drift away. We know what it means to mourn a living person, not because they have died, but because they have chosen a path leading away from life. The faithful watchers seemed to understand that feeling on a cosmic scale, yet despite their sorrow, they remained loyal. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the fifth heaven. Their grief had not turned into bitterness. Their disappointment had not become rebellion. Their pain had not destroyed their faithfulness. Instead, they continued serving God. They continued trusting His wisdom. They continued fulfilling their purpose, even while carrying the memory of what had been lost. And that lesson resonates deeply with me, because one of the greatest tests of faith is remaining faithful when others are not. It is easy to follow God when everyone around us is doing the same. It is far more difficult when people we respect, admire, or love choose a different path. The faithful watchers demonstrate a kind of loyalty that persists even in the presence of heartbreak. A loyalty rooted not in circumstances but in trust. As Enoch listened to them, ancient traditions suggest that some expressed longing for the restoration of all things, not because judgment would be removed, but because they understood the beauty of God's original design. They remembered what heaven had been before rebellion fractured it, and their sorrow revealed just how devastating that fracture truly was. For the first time, Enoch may have begun to grasp the emotional cost of rebellion from heaven's perspective, not merely the punishment, not merely the consequences, but the grief of seeing created beings reject the very source of their existence. Yet, even amid this atmosphere of solemn reflection, there remained hope, because the faithful watchers themselves stood as evidence that loyalty was possible, that obedience was possible, that faithfulness was possible, rebellion was not inevitable, pride was not unavoidable. The existence of these loyal watchers proved that devotion to God could endure, even when others fell away. As Enoch prepared to leave the fifth heaven, I imagine he carried this lesson with him, a lesson about perseverance, about loyalty, about remaining true when surrounded by disappointment. But even this remarkable realm was not the destination of his journey. Beyond the faithful watchers, beyond their quiet sorrow, beyond their enduring obedience, another realm awaited. A realm filled with heavenly records, divine administration, and mysteries connected to the lives of every human being who has ever lived. And what Enoch was about to discover there would reveal something astonishing. that no prayer is forgotten. No act goes unnoticed, and no life passes beyond the sight of God. As Enoch prepared to leave the fifth heaven behind, one lesson seemed to linger in his mind more than any other. The lesson of faithfulness, not power, not knowledge, not status, but faithfulness. Throughout his journey, he had encountered extraordinary beings, angels who governed aspects of creation, heavenly servants who accompanied the sun and stars, mighty watchers who had witnessed events stretching back beyond human history. Yet among all these wonders, one truth appeared again and again. The beings most honored in heaven were not necessarily the most powerful. They were the most faithful. This realization strikes me deeply every time I reflect upon Enoch's journey, because the world often measures success very differently. We celebrate achievement, influence, wealth, recognition. We admire those who rise above others, those who gain authority, those who attract attention. Yet heaven seems to operate according to another standard entirely, again and again. Enoch was shown that greatness in God's kingdom is not defined by how much authority a being possesses, but by how faithfully that authority is used. The loyal watchers had remained in their appointed place. The angels governing creation had remained in their assigned roles. The celestial servants accompanying the sun and stars had remained faithful to their responsibilities. In every realm Enoch visited, obedience and faithfulness appeared more valuable than power itself. And perhaps nowhere was this lesson more visible than in the contrast between the faithful watchers and the fallen ones. Both groups had once possessed extraordinary privilege. Both had been created with purpose. Both had occupied positions of significance, yet one group remained loyal while the other pursued its own desires. The difference was not ability, the difference was faithfulness. Whenever I think about this, I find myself returning to a simple question. What does it actually mean to be faithful? Many people assume faithfulness requires grand accomplishments, dramatic acts of courage, public displays of devotion. Yet, the heavenly examples Enoch encountered suggest something much simpler. Faithfulness often means remaining where God has placed you, continuing to serve when no one is watching, continuing to trust when circumstances become difficult, continuing to obey even when alternative paths appear more attractive. The faithful watchers did not become famous because they pursued greatness. They became honorable because they remained loyal. And perhaps that lesson is more relevant today than ever before. We live in a culture that constantly encourages movement, change, ambition, self-promotion. There's always pressure to seek something bigger, something more visible, something more impressive. Yet Enoch's journey reminds us that faithfulness is not measured by visibility. It is measured by obedience. A person may never become famous, never gain recognition, never achieve worldly success, and still be considered great in the eyes of heaven if they remain faithful to the purpose God has given them. As I imagine Enoch reflecting upon the fifth heaven, I picture him realizing that his own story fits this pattern perfectly. After all, what made Enoch different? What made Enoch different? It was not military victory, political influence, or extraordinary achievement. It was that he walked with God. Day after day, year after year, century after century, he remained faithful. Long before he ever saw angels, long before he ever ascended through the heavens, he had already learned the lesson that heaven now kept reinforcing. Stay close to God, remain faithful, fulfill the purpose you have been given. There is something profoundly comforting about that, because it means that God's evaluation of our lives may be very different from the world's evaluation. Heaven notices things the world overlooks: quiet acts of obedience, hidden acts of kindness, unseen moments of faithfulness, prayers whispered when no one else is listening, choices made when no applause follows. None of these things escape God's attention. In fact, the more Enoch progressed through the heavenly realms, the more it became clear that heaven keeps records of such things in ways humanity rarely considers. And that thought began to stir a new curiosity within him. Up until this point, he had seen the order of creation, the prison of the fallen angels, the beauty of paradise, the endless worship of heaven. Yet, one question remained. How much does heaven actually know about life on earth? Do our prayers matter? Are our actions remembered? Are our choices noticed? The deeper Enoch reflected on these questions, the more he sensed that another revelation was waiting ahead, a revelation unlike any he had encountered so far. Because beyond the realm of the faithful watchers, beyond the lessons of loyalty and obedience, there existed another heavenly domain, a realm inhabited by beings whose responsibilities were unlike those of any angel he had yet seen. These angels did not govern winds. They did not accompany stars. They did not stand guard over prisons. Instead, they were entrusted with something astonishing. They knew the stories of human lives. They knew the prayers that rose from earth. They knew the choices people made when no one else was watching. They knew what was remembered, what was forgotten, and what had been recorded before the throne of God. And as Enoch prepared to enter that mysterious realm, he was about to discover a truth that would forever change the way he understood heaven. For there were angels ahead who seemed to know everything about the lives of men, and what they revealed would leave him speechless. As Enoch departed from the realm of the faithful watchers, a profound sense of anticipation began to grow within him. Every heaven he had entered had revealed another layer of reality. The first heaven had unveiled the hidden order behind creation. The second had exposed the terrible consequences of rebellion. The third had revealed paradise and the destinies awaiting human souls. The fourth had resounded with endless worship. The fifth had taught him the value of faithfulness. Yet now, he was approaching a realm unlike any he had seen before. A realm that would answer questions many people carry throughout their entire lives. Questions about whether our actions matter, whether our prayers are heard, whether anything we do is truly remembered. And as Enoch entered the sixth heaven, he immediately sensed that this place was different. There was a remarkable atmosphere of purpose, not the joyful celebration of the fourth heaven, not the solemn grief of the fifth, but something quieter, something focused, something deeply intentional. It felt almost like entering the center of a vast administration, a heavenly domain where divine purposes were carefully observed, recorded, and preserved. The ancient traditions describe this realm as being inhabited by extraordinary beings, often referred to as heavenly scribes, angels entrusted with responsibilities unlike those assigned to any other heavenly servants Enoch had encountered. These angels did not oversee winds. They did not govern celestial bodies. They did not stand watch over imprisoned rebels. Instead, they were connected to memory, testimony, and record. Whenever I imagine Enoch seeing them for the first time, I picture countless luminous figures moving with quiet purpose, their work unfolding with absolute precision, their attention fixed upon tasks of eternal significance. There was no confusion, no distraction, no uncertainty. Everything seemed perfectly ordered, perfectly maintained. And then Enoch noticed something that immediately captured his attention. Books, scrolls, records beyond counting. Ancient accounts describe heavenly books unlike anything found on earth, not ordinary documents, not simple archives, but records connected to the lives of human beings, records preserving events, choices, prayers, acts of faithfulness, and perhaps even things forgotten by everyone except God himself. Every time I reflect on this part of Enoch's journey, I find myself asking a simple question. What if nothing is truly forgotten? We live in a world where memories fade, names disappear, entire lives pass unnoticed. People perform acts of kindness that no one remembers. They endure suffering that no one fully understands. They offer prayers that seem to vanish into silence. Sometimes it can feel as though human existence leaves only faint traces before disappearing altogether. Yet the sixth heaven presents a radically different picture. A picture in which heaven remembers, a picture in which nothing escapes God's attention. Imagine Enoch standing before these heavenly records. realizing that every life possesses significance, that every decision contributes to a story larger than itself, that every act of faithfulness matters, even those hidden from human eyes. The thought is both comforting and sobering. Comforting because it means our struggles are not overlooked. Sobering because it means our choices are not meaningless. The scriptures themselves contain echoes of this idea, references to books opened before God, records of deeds, records of names, records connected to divine judgment and divine remembrance. Throughout biblical history, the image of heavenly books appears repeatedly, suggesting that heaven is not indifferent to what happens on earth. Rather, heaven pays close attention. What fascinated Enoch most was not merely the existence of the records, it was the beings entrusted to maintain them. The heavenly scribes appeared completely devoted to their purpose, tireless, precise, faithful. There was no possibility of error, no forgotten entry, no lost testimony. Every detail existed within the knowledge of God. And as Enoch observed this remarkable realm, another realization began to emerge. The records were not kept because God struggles to remember. The creator of all things requires no assistance in knowledge. The records existed as testimonies, witnesses to the reality that every life matters, every prayer matters, every act of obedience matters, every choice carries significance. I find that thought deeply encouraging because there are moments in life when faithfulness feels invisible, moments when obedience appears unnoticed, moments when doing the right thing seems to produce little reward. Yet the sixth heaven whispers a different message. Heaven sees, heaven remembers, heaven records. Nothing done for God is ever wasted. Nothing offered in sincerity disappears into emptiness. Every prayer spoken in faith, every act of kindness, every sacrifice made in obedience leaves an imprint known to heaven. Yet there was another side to this revelation, because if faithfulness is remembered, so too are the choices that move people away from God. The heavenly records did not exist merely to celebrate obedience. They existed to bear witness to truth, complete truth, the truth of every human story. And as Enoch stood among these vast records, surrounded by angels who seemed to know more about humanity than humanity knows about itself, he began to understand that heaven's knowledge is far deeper than anyone imagines. But even this astonishing realm was not the culmination of his journey. Beyond the records, beyond the scribes, beyond the books of remembrance, another heaven still remained, a realm closer to the throne than any he had yet entered, a realm inhabited by beings of unimaginable holiness, a realm where prayers rose like incense, where glory intensified beyond description, and where Enoch would soon discover that every sincere prayer ever offered to God had been known, heard, and treasured from the very beginning. As Enoch continued deeper into the sixth heaven, surrounded by the heavenly scribes and the vast records of eternity, a new realization began to unfold before him. The books he had seen were not merely archives of history, they were testimonies. Evidence that heaven was paying attention, evidence that human lives mattered far more than most people realize. Yet among all the records, all the scrolls, all the heavenly witnesses, there was one revelation that seemed to move Enoch more deeply than any other. Heaven was listening, not occasionally, not selectively, but continually. Every sincere prayer spoken from earth was known in heaven. Every cry for mercy, every whispered plea in the darkness, every desperate request offered through tears, every word spoken in faith, none of it had vanished into silence. None of it had been ignored. None of it had been forgotten. Whenever I think about this part of Enoch's journey, I cannot help but imagine the countless prayers rising from the earth at any given moment. A mother praying for her child, a man asking God for strength during suffering, a lonely believer seeking comfort in the middle of the night, someone crying out for forgiveness, someone asking for wisdom, someone simply saying, God, are you there? Most of those prayers are never heard by other people. They disappear into quiet rooms, empty roads, hospital beds, prison cells, places where only God can hear. And yet the sixth heaven reveals a remarkable truth. heaven hears them too. According to ancient traditions associated with Enoch's vision, there were angels entrusted with responsibilities connected to the prayers of humanity, heavenly servants carrying petitions before God. Not because God requires assistance to hear, but because the kingdom of heaven is alive with participation, alive with purpose, alive with service. Just as angels governed aspects of creation, just as angels fulfilled assignments among the stars and heavens, so too there were angels connected to the prayers rising from earth. Imagine Enoch witnessing this extraordinary sight, streams of prayers ascending from every corner of the world. Some strong and confident, others fragile and broken, some filled with gratitude, others filled with pain, yet all of them known, all of them received, all of them entering the awareness of heaven. And perhaps what astonished him most was not the number of prayers, but the care with which they were handled. Nothing appeared lost, nothing appeared overlooked. Every sincere prayer carried significance. Every cry of faith mattered. Every act of trust left its mark upon eternity. This brings us to another image found throughout Scripture, the idea of a scroll of remembrance. A record kept before God, a testimony preserving what human beings often forget. Whenever I encounter this concept, I find it deeply comforting, because human memory is fragile. We forget promises, we forget kindnesses, we forget sacrifices. Entire lives can disappear from public memory within a generation or two, yet heaven remembers. The scroll of remembrance stands as a symbol of God's perfect awareness, a declaration that faithfulness is never wasted, that obedience is never unnoticed, that prayers do not vanish into emptiness. Imagine Enoch standing before these heavenly records and realizing that every act of devotion leaves a trace, every moment of trust, every decision to remain faithful when giving up would have been easier, every prayer offered in hope despite uncertainty, all of it remembered, all of it preserved. The thought becomes even more powerful when we consider how often people feel forgotten, how many believers have prayed prayers that seemed unanswered, how many have cried out during seasons of suffering, wondering whether heaven was listening at all. I know many people have asked those questions. Perhaps you have asked them too. Perhaps there have been moments when silence felt overwhelming, moments when you wondered if your prayers reached beyond the ceiling, moments when it seemed as though no answer would ever come. Yet the sixth heaven offers different perspective. It suggests that the absence of an immediate answer is not the absence of divine attention. God hears before we see results. God remembers before we understand his plans. God records what we often assume has been forgotten. This does not mean every prayer receives the answer we expect. It does not mean every request unfolds according to our preferred timeline. But it does mean that no sincere prayer is wasted. No tear shed before God disappears unnoticed. No cry of faith is lost in the vastness of the universe. Every prayer enters a reality larger than we can see. A reality Enoch was being allowed to witness firsthand. As he observed the heavenly scribes and the records surrounding them, he began to understand that heaven is far more personal than many people imagine. God is not distant, not indifferent, not disconnected from human experience. He knows, he remembers, he listens, and perhaps that realization alone would have made the entire journey worthwhile. Yet Enoch's ascent was not finished, because beyond the heavenly records, beyond the scrolls of remembrance, beyond the angels entrusted with humanity's prayers, another realm still awaited him, a realm so holy, so radiant, so overwhelming, that even the greatest heavenly beings approached it with reverence. The closer he moved toward it, the brighter the glory became. The atmosphere itself seemed charged with holiness. The songs of worship grew more intense. The sense of divine presence became almost overwhelming. And Enoch realized that he was approaching the highest heaven of all, the place where the throne of God awaited, the place where every journey ultimately led, the place few created beings had ever seen. And what stood beyond that radiant veil would surpass everything he had witnessed so far. As Enoch moved beyond the realm of the heavenly records, beyond the angels who carried the prayers of humanity, beyond the scrolls preserving the stories of countless lives. He sensed that he was approaching the culmination of his journey. Every heaven he had entered seemed to prepare him for this moment. The first heaven had revealed order, the second had revealed judgment, the third had revealed destiny, the fourth had revealed worship, the fifth had revealed faithfulness, the sixth had revealed remembrance. But now, ahead of him stood the highest realm of all, the seventh heaven, and even before he entered it, he knew this place was different. The atmosphere itself seemed alive with holiness. The brilliance surrounding him grew so intense that ordinary language struggled to describe it. It was not merely light, it was something greater. A radiance flowing from the presence of God himself, a glory that seemed to permeate everything. Whenever I try to imagine what Enoch must have experienced, I quickly realize the limits of human understanding. We describe light using comparisons: sunlight, fire, lightning, stars. Yet the light of the seventh heaven appeared to surpass every earthly analogy. It was pure, living, overwhelming, not harsh, yet impossible to ignore, not destructive, yet so powerful that it exposed every shadow, every imperfection, every illusion. It was the kind of light that reveals truth simply by existing. And as Enoch approached this unimaginable radiance, he became aware of beings unlike any he had previously encountered. These were not the angels who governed creation. They were not the watchers. They were not the heavenly scribes. These beings belonged to the highest realm, the closest servants of the throne. Ancient traditions and biblical imagery often refer to them as the seraphim. Whenever I think about the seraphim, I am reminded of the prophet Isaiah's vision, a vision in which heavenly beings stood before the throne of God, crying out continuously, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts." The repetition itself carries significance, not because God needs constant praise, but because his holiness is so profound, so inexhaustible, that every revelation of his nature inspires fresh worship. The seraphim existed in the immediate presence of God's glory, and yet even they covered themselves in reverence. Imagine that for a moment. Beings of unimaginable splendor, beings untouched by human weakness, still overwhelmed by the holiness of God. Their worship was not routine. It was a response to an endless revelation of divine majesty. Every moment before the throne brought new reasons for awe, new reasons for wonder, new reasons to proclaim his holiness. And yet the seraphim were not alone. Enoch also became aware of another order of heavenly beings, the cherubim. Throughout Scripture, cherubim appear in places of extraordinary significance, guarding the entrance to Eden after humanity's fall, overshadowing the Ark of the Covenant, appearing in prophetic visions filled with mystery and power. They are often associated with the presence, authority, and glory of God. Whenever I read those passages, I am struck by how frequently the cherubim appear wherever heaven and earth intersect. Wherever God's throne is emphasized, wherever divine majesty is revealed, the cherubim seem to be nearby. And now, standing within the seventh heaven, Enoch witnessed them directly, not as symbols, not as artistic representations, but as living servants surrounding the throne of the Creator. The further Enoch advanced into this realm, the more difficult it became to focus on individual details, not because the details disappeared, but because everything seemed increasingly consumed by glory. The light continued to intensify. The worship continued to rise. The awareness of God's presence grew stronger with every step. Ancient descriptions often struggle to capture this experience. They speak of fire, crystal, radiance, lightning, precious stones. Yet every image feels incomplete. Every comparison falls short. It is as though language itself reaches its limits when confronted with the reality of God's immediate presence. And perhaps that is exactly the point. Some realities are too great for words. Some truths must be experienced rather than explained. As Enoch stood within the seventh heaven, surrounded by seraphim, cherubim, and unimaginable glory, one truth became overwhelmingly clear. God is not merely greater than creation, he is categorically beyond it. Every angel, every star, Every heaven, every realm Enoch had visited existed because of him. Everything depended upon him. Everything pointed toward him. The entire journey through the heavens had been moving toward this realization. Not the greatness of angels, not the mysteries of heaven, not the wonders of paradise, but the greatness of God himself. And yet, as overwhelming as this revelation was, Enoch had still not reached the final moment. He had entered the highest heaven. He had witnessed the servants surrounding the throne. He had seen the indescribable light. But the throne itself still lay ahead, the source of the glory, the center of the worship, the destination toward which every heaven pointed. And as Enoch moved closer, the brilliance became almost unbearable. The songs of the seraphim seemed to fill every corner of existence. The cherubim remained steadfast before the presence of the Almighty. And Enoch realized that he was only moments away from witnessing what few created beings had ever seen. The throne of the Ancient of Days, the throne from which all authority flows, the throne before which every angel bows, the throne of God himself. Thus, at last, after passing through every heaven, after witnessing the hidden order of creation, the prison of the fallen angels, the beauty of paradise, the endless worship of the celestial realms, the faithfulness of the watchers, and the heavenly records that preserve every prayer, Enoch arrived at the destination toward which the entire journey had been leading: the throne of the Ancient of Days, the throne of God. Every step of the ascent had prepared him for this moment, yet nothing could truly prepare a created being for what he was about to experience. The closer Enoch moved toward the throne, the more the glory intensified. The light surrounding him was no longer merely brilliant. It seemed alive, flowing outward from a source beyond imagination. The songs of the seraphim echoed endlessly through the heavenly realm. Holy, holy, holy. Their worship rising like waves without beginning or end. The cherubim stood in reverent service, their attention fixed entirely upon the one seated upon the throne. And then Enoch saw it, the throne itself. Ancient traditions struggle to describe what appeared before him. Words like fire, crystal, sapphire, lightning, brilliance, radiance, all emerge in attempts to capture the scene, yet every description feels incomplete, because the throne was not merely an object, it was the visible center of divine authority, the place from which all creation received its existence, the place from which justice flowed, the place from which mercy flowed, the place from which every star, every angel, every kingdom, every human life ultimately derived its meaning. As I imagine Enoch standing there, I find myself thinking about how small he must have felt. Not small in a humiliating sense, but small in the way a person feels when standing before something infinitely greater than themselves, like gazing into the depths of the ocean, or looking up into a sky filled with countless stars, except infinitely more profound. For the first time, Enoch was not simply learning about God. He was standing before the source of all reality. And perhaps that is why every part of the journey suddenly made sense. The first heaven had revealed order, because God is a God of order. The second heaven had revealed judgment, because God is perfectly just. The third heaven had revealed paradise and separation, because God honors the choices of his creation. The fourth heaven had revealed worship, because God alone is worthy of worship. The fifth heaven had revealed faithfulness, because God himself is faithful. The sixth heaven had revealed remembrance, because God forgets nothing and sees all things. Every heaven reflected an aspect of his character. Every realm pointed toward him. Every revelation prepared Enoch for this final encounter. Standing before the throne, Enoch understood that the journey was never really about heaven. It was about God. Heaven was magnificent. The angels were extraordinary. Paradise was beautiful. The mysteries were breathtaking. But none of them were the destination. The destination was always the Creator himself. And that realization may be the greatest lesson hidden within the story of Enoch, because so many people become fascinated by heavenly mysteries, by angels, by prophecies, by visions, by signs and wonders. Yet Enoch's journey reminds us that all true revelation, ultimately points toward God, not away from Him, not toward curiosity alone, but toward relationship. As I reflect on everything Enoch witnessed, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. God is real, not merely as an idea, not merely as a tradition, not merely as a belief inherited from previous generations, but as the living creator whose presence sustains all things, the one before whom angels bow, the one whose glory fills the heavens, the one who remains seated upon the throne above every power and authority. And if God is real, then heaven is real. The realms Enoch witnessed were not presented as fantasies. They were realities existing beyond ordinary human sight. Real places, real beings, real destinies, real worship, real glory. And if heaven is real, then judgment is real. The second heaven and the great divide of the third heaven made that unmistakably clear. Choices matter. Faithfulness matters. Rebellion matters. The universe is not morally indifferent. Every life moves toward an eternal outcome. Every decision carries significance. Every soul ultimately stands before the reality of God. And if judgment is real, then eternity is real. Human life is not simply a brief accident between birth and death. We are beings created for something greater, something beyond the limits of time, something extending far beyond the years we spend upon this earth. The story of Enoch pulls back the curtain and reminds us that eternity is not a distant concept. It is the ultimate reality toward which every human life is moving. Yet, perhaps the most important lesson of all emerges not from the heavens themselves, but from Enoch's life before he ever entered them. Because when the journey began, Enoch was not a king, not a warrior, not a prophet performing miracles before crowds. He was simply a man who walked with God, day after day, year after year, century after century. Long before he saw angels, long before he saw paradise, long before he stood before the throne, he chose relationship, he chose faithfulness, he chose to walk with God. And perhaps that is the invitation hidden within his story. Not necessarily to see what Enoch saw, not necessarily to ascend through heavenly realms, but to follow the same path of faithfulness, to walk with God in ordinary life, to trust Him in uncertainty, to remain faithful when others turn away, to remember that every prayer is heard, every act of obedience is remembered, every choice matters, because at the end of every journey, beyond every mystery, beyond every question, beyond every heaven, stands the same eternal reality that Enoch discovered. The throne of the Ancient of Days, the living God, waiting not merely to be understood, but to be known,